Despite suffering a fatal wound, Chenhu becomes the winner of the tournament, and the lion god offers him the prize he desired most, godhood itself. But in the very next moment, something happens that makes the lion change his mind forever about granting Chenhu divine power, and even curse him. Episode 2. Abandon and Become a God. The fires in the city burned until dawn. Not the kind of fires people light against the cold or out of necessity. These were festive fires, fat and generous, throwing sparks into the night sky like small souls with nowhere to be in a hurry. Around them sat people, townspeople, merchants, fighters, pilgrims who had come from far away just to see with their own eyes a mortal become a god. The smell of roasting meat and sweet rice wine mingled with smoke and the damp of the night, and the whole city breathed one breath. Excited, intoxicated, a little reckless, the way people breathe when they have allowed themselves for one night to forget about tomorrow. Sifu had no intention of forgetting about tomorrow. He remembered tomorrow very well, and that was precisely why he was reaching for the cup of sake with the decisiveness of a man reaching for something he intends to do right now, before anyone stops him. Chenhu stopped him. "Put it down," he said briefly, without looking at Sifu. He was watching the fire. "It's a celebration," Sifu objected, with the intonation of a man stating an obvious truth. "People are celebrating. The gods are celebrating. Even that dog by the fence over there, by the look of him, is celebrating. Tomorrow is a fight." "Tomorrow is a fight," Sifu agreed. "But tonight is tonight. There is a difference between them which you, it seems, are making a point of refusing to acknowledge." Chenhu finally looked at him. Not for long, just long enough for a man to understand that he had been heard and that the decision had already been made. Sifu held the cup for another second, set it down, pushed it away from himself with deliberate emphasis, then slid it back halfway, a compromise he was prepared to accept, and no further. The old man was sitting on the other side of the fire. Chenhu did not notice him at first. He had appeared quietly, the way people appear who are accustomed to existing at the edge of other people's attention, making no claim on the center. His face was deeply carved by time, like the bark of an old tree that had outlived several generations of people who had lived beneath it. His eyes were alive, with that particular brightness that sometimes remains in very old people as the last thing age cannot take. Around him, people gradually gathered, first children, then adults, then fighters who had come simply to listen, because the fire and the old man's voice created something together that made no one want to leave. The old man was speaking about demons, not about what they look like. Everyone knew enough about that already, some from rumor, some from their own grief. He was speaking about where they come from, and that was not what the temples taught. "In the beginning of everything," said the old man, "there was nothing bad. There was thirst, but not vice, simply the desire to drink when the throat was dry. There was passion, but not obsession, simply the warmth of being near someone you love. There was merriment, but not madness, simply laughter by a fire after a long day. All of it was clean. All of it was right. But right things are the most vulnerable because they are easy to bend without breaking, to change without destroying. The desire to drink at festivals became the desire to drink always. The warmth near a beloved became obsession, pursuit, a prison without bars. Laughter became cruelty, which also laughs, only differently. Love became passion. Passion became vice. Vice became darkness. And from that darkness, from that slow, almost imperceptible distortion of what had once been good, from it the demons came. Not from outside, from within. Sifu listened with the expression that appears on people who have just heard something uncomfortable and have not yet decided what to do with it. "So," he said quietly, more to himself than to the old man, "demons are us, only worse." "Demons feed on what we produce," said the old man, without raising his voice, but in such a way that everyone around him heard. Fear, hatred, pain, despair. They don't simply exist alongside people. They need people, the way fire needs wood. The gods feed on faith and worship, on bright things that are harder to produce. One prayer weighs less than one scream in the night. 10 good thoughts do not outweigh one genuine fear. It is easier for demons. It has always been easier. And that is why there are more of them, and why they are stronger than they ought to be. Someone in the crowd, a man with a hard face, the kind that life has taught not to trust beautiful words, smirked and said loudly, so the people nearby would hear. It's easy for the lion god to make sacrifices. He's the god of the sun. The sun gives him strength every day without stopping. Whatever he is patron of feeds him. Let him try sacrificing when there's nothing left to give. The old man did not grow angry. He looked into the crowd for a long time, searching for the one who had spoken, found him, regarded him calmly and without judgment, only attentively, the way you look at a person in whom you have just seen something important. It is thoughts like that, he said quietly, that make souls weak. Not because the thought is wrong, but because it is convenient. A convenient thought is one that allows you to do nothing. Why sacrifice if the one who sacrifices already has more? Why believe if the gods will manage regardless? Why struggle if the outcome is already decided? He paused. Demons do not instill fear in those who are already afraid. They instill it in those who are only beginning to doubt. That is where their work begins. The man fell silent, not because he agreed, simply because he could find nothing to say in return. Sometimes silence looks the same either way. Chenhu listened. He sat without moving, the way people sit when something inside them is moving very fast while everything outside has gone still. The fire before him threw amber shadows across the ground, and the shadows moved like living things. Inconstant, like everything that depends on someone else's source of light. Quote 14, he said at last. The old man looked at him. Quote 15. Chenhu did not hurry. He placed each word carefully, the way you place stepping stones across a river, one after another, checking whether each will hold. Quote 16 The silence around the fire changed. The old man did not look away. He looked at Chenhu for a long time, longer than a man looks when he is simply thinking over an answer, as though the question had told him something about the one who asked it that the asker had not intended to reveal. Quote 17, quote, he said at last. Quote 18, quote. Quote 19, quote, said Chenhu. Quote 20, quote. The old man agreed. Quote 21, quote. Chenhu looked at him for one more second, then stood. The movement was calm, without display. Simply a man enacting a decision that had already been made some time ago and was now only finding its expression. Quote 22 asked Sifu, reaching for the cup and then pulling his hand back, a reflex developed over the past several hours. Quote 23, said Chenhu. Quote 24. Sifu looked at the fire, at the old man, at the back of the departing Chenhu. Quote 25. Quote, he said quietly, addressing no one in particular. Quote 26. Quote, he rose, adjusted his scabbard, took a step after Chenhu, then turned back to look at the old man, who was watching both of them go with an expression Sifu would not have been able to describe in words even if he had tried. Not anxiety, not pity, something between knowing and waiting. The way a man looks who has already seen how stories like this one end, and still hopes that this particular story will turn out differently. The fires burned. The city celebrated. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the walls lay mountains, and in the mountains stood that dojo with its sagging roof, and the grave at the foot of the slope beneath the twisted pine, and all of it that Chenhu had left behind and that followed him regardless, soundlessly, without pause, the way a shadow follows a man even when he does not look down. Tomorrow the contests would begin, and the fire in Chenhu's chest, the very one the old man had called dangerous, did not go out. The city woke quickly. Not the way places wake where life flows at an even pace and each day resembles the one before. This city woke with a jolt, the way a person wakes who is dreaming something important and suddenly remembers that today something is going to happen. Before dawn, the merchants were already moving through the streets with their baskets, before the temple bells struck once the stalls were open. The braziers lit, and the smell of hot broth and toasted sesame drifted above the cobblestones like the promise of a good day. The kind of promise a city makes to its people on festival days, and sometimes even keeps. Boys had been running to the arena since first light. They clambered onto fences and rooftops, claimed spots at the barriers, jostled with their elbows and argued. Who would win? Who was stronger? Who would one day walk onto this very ground and show everyone? Each of them, on this particular morning, was a little bit a future chosen one. None of them yet knew that most such mornings end in an ordinary day. Chenhu and Sifu came out onto the arena with the other participants when the sun had only just cleared the city wall, and long shadows still lay across the grounds, which were divided into sectors. Spear throwing, archery, wrestling, sword fighting. Each sector a separate world with its own rules, its own smell, its own silence before the start. Sifu surveyed the participants with the air of a man taking inventory before a major transaction. Mo is here, he said quietly, nodding to one side. I thought as much. Men like that don't miss these things. Chenhu looked. Mo stood where he always stood, slightly apart, with the particular composure of a man who has no need to occupy space in order to occupy it. The scar on his cheekbone looked deeper in the morning light than it had the day before. This won't be an easy contest, Sifu continued, but I still intend to win. You're not short on confidence, said Chenhu. Should a fighter be modest? Sifu raised an eyebrow. We all came here to become the chosen one. None of us is modest, Chenhu. The modest ones stayed home. There's a difference between wanting victory and announcing it in advance. That's called tcheslavie, vanity, said Chenhu. Sifu smirked with the air of a man who had long since prepared his answer to this particular question. Vanity is when you want to seem better than you are. I simply want to seem exactly as I am. That's called accurate self-assessment. He spread his hands. The difference is fundamental. Chenhu did not reply. He was already looking further, toward the groups of participants who stood apart from the rest. Clans. By their clothing, their colors, the way they moved, in unison, like a single organism, they were visible at once. Clan of the wind, said Sifu under his breath. Clan of fire, clan of water, clan of earth. They worship the elemental gods, each their own, and not without reason. Their gods actually notice them. The larger the flock, the more attention. A fighter from the dragon clan goes into combat with the wind literally at his back. The tortoise helps its own in a bout. Imagine fighting for an hour and feeling no thirst. A small thing, but in a long fight it isn't small. It's hard to fight men whose gods are helping them, said Chenhu evenly. Exactly. Sifu was quiet for a moment. And which clan are you from? None. Sifu glanced at him sideways. Neither am I, he said, and for a fraction of a second something entered his voice that was not usually there. He removed it immediately. With a habitual movement, the way you put away something you don't want seen. __quote _45 ___. He said it with a smirk. But Chenhu noticed. It flickered and was gone, like the shadow of a cloud passing over water. Something else. Not bitterness, not self-pity, simply a fact that a man had long since accepted and carried in silence ever since, because carrying it aloud is heavier. Every solitary person has their own story. Chenhu knew this better than anyone. He did not ask. Not because there was no interest, but because he understood. Such things are not told. They are heard in what goes unsaid. Quote 46, said Sifu suddenly, and his voice changed. Chenhu followed his gaze. At the far edge of the arena stood warriors in armor, black with a tiger pattern, gold-plated pauldrons shaped like claws. There were many of them, no fewer than 20, and each of them carried that bearing which does not come from training, which is beaten in from childhood, when the body does not yet know any other way to stand. Quote, 47, said Sifu quietly, and this was perhaps the first time in their acquaintance that he said anything quietly without any irony at all. Quote, 48, asked Chenhu. Quote, 49. Sifu swallowed. Quote, 50. Quote, 51, said Chenhu. Quote, 52. Sifu rubbed his face. Quote, 53. He paused. Quote, 54. Quote, 55, asked Chenhu. Quote, 56. Quote, 57. Sifu narrowed his eyes. Quote, 58. Chenhu looked at the Claw clan in silence. He thought about how he had come here with a single purpose, into a world that had turned out to be considerably more complicated than it had appeared from a mountain slope. Sifu asked suddenly, said Chenhu. Sifu opened his mouth, closed it, understood there would be no continuation, and nodded with the air of a man who has accepted terms he doesn't like, but has no alternative. And then he fell silent again, abruptly, the way people fall silent when they see something that sends words back where they came from. Chenhu followed his gaze. At the entrance to the arena stood people dressed in black. Not simply dark clothing, black, without ornament, without clan colors, without any mark of belonging. Nothing superfluous. Their faces were covered to the eyes. They moved almost soundlessly, and in the way they occupied space there was something of water seeping into cracks. Unnoticed, unstoppable. Do you know who they are? Asked Sifu. I know, said Chenhu. One of the people in black looked in his direction, then looked away, then looked back, deliberately, with the slow deliberateness that is more frightening than any threat spoken aloud. Then separated from the group and approached, stopped 2 paces away. Chenhu, he said. His voice was flat, like the surface of water on a windless day, and just as cold. Good to see you here. I hope we'll have the chance to meet on the grounds. There was not a single hostile word in that sentence, which was precisely why it sounded like a knife. The man in black turned and rejoined his group. Chenhu watched him go. Who was that? Asked Sifu, and this time there was no irony in his voice. The Dark Thread clan, said Chenhu. Assassins. The ones I refused. Sifu was quiet, swallowed. So, he said slowly, they didn't come here for the title of the Chosen One. No. They came for you. Most likely. Sifu watched the receding black figures, then looked at Chenhu, then back at the figures. You know, he said at last, with the air of a man who has found the only possible way to exist with an unpleasant situation. I don't envy the person that the oldest clan of hired killers wants dead. 300 years they've been doing their work. 300 years. Even the gods, they say, prefer not to touch them. It's more trouble than it's worth. He shook his head. And you refused them, just like that. Yes, said Chenhu. Out of politeness, they said. People say all sorts of things. Sifu looked once more at the black figures, who had now taken their places among the other participants. Quiet, unremarkable, completely indistinguishable from everyone else if you didn't know what to look for. Quote, 81, he said at last. Quote, 82. Chenhu did not answer. He was watching the arena, where targets were already being set up for the first contest, and thinking that the most dangerous enemies at this tournament would not be the ones he would have to fight by the rules. The gods took their places beside the arena with the unhurried magnificence of something for which the concept of being late does not exist in principle. The lion god rose from his throne, briefly, without preamble. Quote 83 __. That was sufficient. The first contests were the hunting events, spear throwing and archery. Targets were set at varying distances, from close range to distances where the human eye could barely distinguish the mark, only a dark spot against a pale background trembling in the morning haze. Participants came forward in groups, received their weapons, took their positions. Everything was arranged with that military precision which leaves no room for chance, or creates the appearance of doing so. Chenhu took a spear, weighed it in his hand, with the habitual movement of a hunter weighing any tool before trusting it. The balance was shifted slightly toward the head, the shaft denser than he was used to in the mountains. Not worse, simply different. He made one trial arc, found the rhythm, and when the start was called, threw. The spear entered the center of the target without fuss. Second throw. Third. Each one, the same place. Not because he was lucky, because in the mountains there is no luck. You either hit or you go hungry, and that simple arithmetic had over the years become something that no longer required thought. Sifu threw well too, accurately, confidently, with that studied nonchalance which with him was always calculated for the audience in precisely equal measure to the result. He hit, looked around, found Mo with his eyes. Mo threw without superfluous movement, without theater, simply placing the spear on target with the same intonation as driving a nail into a board you have known for years. Quote 84, said Sifu, returning to Chenhu. Quote 85. Chenhu was already watching the archers. He had handled a bow for a long time, since the days in the mountains when there was no other way to find food except to hit a hare at 50 paces in the failing light. The bowstring settled onto his fingers in the familiar way. His elbow drew back. His breath found the right moment on its own. That tiny pause between the inhale and the exhale, when the body becomes completely still for a fraction of a second. The arrow flew. A 10. Another. Another. Sifu stood nearby and watched with the expression of a man watching something simultaneously magnificent and irritating. Quote 86, he said, when Chenhu lowered the bow. Quote 87. Quote 88, said Chenhu. Quote 89, Sifu clarified. Quote 90. The Water Clan shot next. Several of their fighters missed, arrows going slightly wide, not critically, but noticeably. Sifu immediately turned in their direction and called across the entire field with that radiant lack of ceremony which was his natural state. Quote 91 __. Laughter from the spectators. And then, silence. Because Sifu caught the tortoise's gaze. The god of water sat in his place and looked at him with two different eyes, the left the color of deep water, the right the color of young leaves. Both looked the same, with that absolute inhuman composure that belongs to beings who have watched mountains collapse and found no particular cause for concern in it. Sifu closed his mouth, slowly turned back around, stared at the ground in front of him with the air of a man who had suddenly discovered something extraordinarily interesting there. Good ground, he said quietly. Quality ground. The lion god raised his head. The warriors are skilled, he said, and in his voice was that particular intonation which precedes something no one asked for. But a stationary target is an exercise for students. Let us see how you shoot when the world around you stops being convenient. He nodded to the air dragon. The dragon sat in his place, long, white, his green mane lying along his spine like river grass in a current. He looked at the arena, then slowly began to breathe. At first, nothing. Then Chenhu felt the air around him grow slightly denser, slightly heavier, the way it does before a storm. Then, a pull. Faint, barely perceptible, as though someone had opened a distant window. Then stronger. The tournament participants began to exchange glances. Some rubbed their chests, some instinctively widened their nostrils, trying to catch air that was becoming scarcer. The dragon inhaled, drawing the air from the arena into his lungs the way a whirlpool draws water, unstoppably, evenly, without malice, simply as a natural force doing its work. Several fighters in the front rows sank to one knee, not from weakness, simply because the body seeks stability on its own when the head begins to swim. One fell, then two more. Chenhu stood. His chest tightened, not painfully but perceptibly, as though invisible hands had taken hold of his ribs from the outside and were slowly closing. He did not fight it. He simply breathed, slowly, deeply, drawing from the air everything that remained in it. The mountains had taught this too. Altitude teaches economy. Then the dragon stopped and exhaled. The wind did not come gradually. It struck all at once, from every direction simultaneously, as though the air that had been owed to the arena returned all at once with interest. The ground was hit by a squall, not simply wind, but a true vortex that caught the hems of garments, ripped hoods from heads, bent the shafts of spears in the hands of those who still held them. The targets at the far range swayed. Then the squall intensified into a typhoon, and the targets were shaking like living things, shifting right and left by several paces. To shoot in such conditions is no longer an art. It is a conversation with chaos. Most missed. Chenhu felt a gust, powerful, lateral, pushing him to the left, and took half a step sideways to compensate. He found the target in his sights. It was moving right, then jerked left, then right again. He waited. Not guessing. Waiting. Because every movement has a rhythm, even chaos if you watch long enough. The target moved left. He fired at the place it would reach. The arrow entered the edge of the 10. Not the center, but a 10. Nearby, a hit. Sifu had connected too. Mo connected. The Claw clan, most of them. The assassins in black, all of them, quietly, without display, as though the hurricane around them were simply a light breeze. The dragon folded his wings. The storm subsided as quickly as it had begun. On the arena lay several torn-off hoods and someone's spear, carried by the wind into the far corner of the barrier. Sifu lowered his bow, drew his palm across his face, clearing hair, dust, and whatever remained of his dignity that the hurricane had not yet carried off. Quote, 96, quote, he said. Quote, 97, quote. He paused. Quote, 98, quote. Chenhu did not answer. He was watching the officials record the results, quickly, matter-of-factly, paying no attention to the fact that a hurricane had been here several minutes ago, as though it were simply another item on the program. Perhaps it was. The transition to hand-to-hand combat was announced. The targets were cleared, the sector cleaned. Fighters began taking their positions. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 99, underscore, underscore, said Sifu to Chenhu with that particular expression which appeared when he was trying to look serious, and it was almost working. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 100, underscore, underscore. Chenhu looked at him and smiled, briefly, barely perceptibly, the way people smile when it happens rarely, and therefore always looks a little unexpected. The lion god raised his head again. Quote 101, quote, he said, surveying the thinned ranks. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 102, underscore, underscore. He nodded to the earth god. The deer rose from his place slowly, with the heavy unhurriedness of creatures who know the earth is not going anywhere, because it is theirs. He approached the edge of the arena, lowered himself to his knees, and placed both palms on the stone of the ground. The earth changed quietly. Without cracking, without rumbling, simply the firm surface underfoot began to give way, the way ice gives way in spring when there is no longer solid ground beneath it but water. The stone did not disappear. It became soft, viscous, like wet clay that takes the impression of every step and does not release it. Fighters began sinking to their ankles, losing the stability that had seemed so self-evident a moment before. Hand-to-hand combat on unstable ground is no longer combat. It is a conversation about balance, conducted by bodies while minds are still thinking about technique. Sifu stepped forward, felt his foot sink into the viscous mud, and in that moment his opponent struck. Not hard, simply taking advantage of the fact that Sifu had lost a fraction of a second determining where the ground now was. The blow landed on his jaw. Sifu stepped back, spat something, shook his head. Points lost. Chenhu observed this from the corner of his eye while waiting his turn. He was thinking about the ground, about how it holds and how it lets go. In the mountains, the ground had always been unreliable. Scree, wet stone, snow-concealing ice. The master had said, "Do not trust the ground, trust yourself. Find balance within, not without." His turn came. His opponent was larger, a broad-shouldered fighter from the Fire clan, with that attacking manner which works well on firm ground and somewhat less well on any other kind. He advanced immediately, pressing with his weight. Chenhu did not move, not because he could not, because there was no need. His feet found stability not in the ground, but in his own center of gravity, low and rooted, like a tree that knows the roots matter more than the soil. His opponent struck. He moved his torso aside without shifting his feet. His opponent pressed. He redistributed his weight, remaining in place. The viscous earth beneath him squelched, but moved him nowhere. He stood the way a stone stands in a river, not because the river is weak, but because the stone knows its place. His opponent opened on the fourth strike. Chenhu struck once. That was sufficient. He stepped aside and walked over to Sifu, who was sitting at the edge of the sector, carefully touching his jaw with the air of a man checking whether his teeth were still in place. Quote, 103, said Sifu, without taking his fingers from his face. He glanced at Chenhu. A pause. Chenhu sat down beside him. The deer god returned to his place. The ground beneath the arena slowly hardened again, as though nothing had happened. The sword tournament began at noon. The sun stood directly over the arena, without shadow and without mercy, and the heat on the open ground was such that the air above the stone trembled with a fine ripple, like air above a flame, only without the flame, simply scorched air existing for the sake of its own discomfort. Those who did not handle a sword moved to the benches at the barrier. Chenhu sat down. Sifu remained standing. He was competing in this event, and his expression made it clear that the defeat in hand-to-hand combat required immediate correction. Quote 107 he called toward those who had taken the benches, with the broad gesturing of a man who needs to be heard by everyone, and especially by those who will find it most unpleasant. Quote 108 Several people laughed. Several winced. The Claw clan did not react at all. They stood in their formation and looked straight ahead with that even, practiced composure, which was itself a weapon. People who know they are going to win rarely waste time on those who shout. Chenhu watched the assassins. They stood together, in black, indistinguishable from their own shadows in the midday light. None of them were looking at the arena. They were looking at Chenhu. Not all at once, not demonstratively. Simply at any given moment, one of them was keeping him in their field of vision, passing that gaze to the next so smoothly that if you didn't know what to look for, it could have been taken for coincidence. Chenhu knew what to look for. "Why are they here?" he said quietly, addressing no one in particular. Sifu, adjusting his sword belt nearby, glanced at him. "Who, exactly?" "The assassins." Chenhu watched the black figures. Why would a clan that kills people for hire participate in the gods' tournament? They don't want to become the chosen one. To become the chosen one means serving the gods, going up against demons. That is entirely different work from what they do. Why would they want an official position in the pantheon? Sifu was quiet for a moment, a rare occurrence for him. Maybe someone paid them, he said at last, or asked, or threatened. With the Dark Thread clan, you never know what stands behind an action. There is always a client. He paused again. Or maybe they don't need to become the chosen one. Maybe they just need to make sure someone else doesn't. Chenhu looked at him.
You mean me? What I mean, said Sifu carefully, the way people speak when formulating an unpleasant thought they have already thought, but not yet decided whether to say aloud, is that the oldest clan of hired killers may have a very wide range of clients. And some of those clients may have an interest in this tournament ending in a particular way. He added nothing. That was sufficient. The lion god raised his head, and conversations died on their own. Not because anyone commanded silence, but simply because that is what happens when something speaks whose voice the body responds to before the mind does. The sword contest is always a living event, said the lion. War does not wait for a convenient moment. War comes when you are tired, when you are wounded, when the ground beneath your feet is not the ground you are accustomed to. We will see how you fight not in favorable conditions, but in real ones. He nodded. The phoenix opened his eyes. That was the only movement. He simply opened his eyes, and they were red. Not like blood, but like coals in the moment when you blow on them and they ignite from within. The space above the arena changed slowly. First, the air became denser, then warmer, then hotter. And then not simply hotter, but such that the first rows of participants began wiping their faces with the backs of their hands, though there was nothing to wipe. The sweat evaporated before it had time to appear. The stone underfoot began radiating heat from below, the sun from above. The phoenix, from his place, simply with his gaze, simply with his presence. Someone removed their armor. Quickly, without deliberation. Metal in the sun in such heat becomes not protection, but torment. Someone left the arena altogether, without waiting for any announcement, simply turned and walked away. And in that departure there was nothing shameful, only the honesty of a person who knows their limits. There were quite a few such departures. Those who remained were the ones whose limits lay further than most, or those who had no choice. Sifu fought in the heat with the ferocity of a man who has something to prove and has decided to prove it right now, regardless of the temperature. He had lost the hand-to-hand bout, the ground had let him down, and that he had accepted as a temporary setback caused by external circumstances, not as a statement about himself. The sword was his conversation, and in that conversation he was eloquent. He won. Without elegance, with difficulty, wiping his face between rounds. But he won. Mo fought the way he stood, without superfluous movement, without theater. In the heat he seemed only to grow more focused, as though the warmth stripped from him everything that was not needed, leaving only what worked. His opponent yielded quickly. Not from weakness, simply understanding that continuation served no purpose and being honest about it. The Claw clan fought the way the Claw clan fought, in unison, with that tactical precision which looks almost dull from the outside because it holds no surprises. Each of their fighters knew exactly what was needed and did exactly what had been learned. It was not beauty, it was reliability. Reliability brought to such a degree that it becomes nearly insurmountable. The assassins fought quietly. Quietly, precisely. Without battle cries, without display, simply entering the sector, ending the bout, and leaving. Most of the assassins' opponents yielded before the situation became critical, as though in the very presence of these people there was something that persuaded you not to continue. Then Chenhu was called. He rose from the bench, took the staff, the same one bought from the old man in the square, polished by someone else's years to a warm shine.
walked out onto the sector. The laughter did not begin at once. First surprise, then someone snickered. Then laughter rolled through the rows of spectators like a stone down a mountainside, gathering speed. Even several of the gods, the lesser ones, those who had arrived without particular ceremony, exchanged glances with that expression which on human faces would mean a suppressed smile. The goddess of the crescent did not laugh. She watched Chenhu with that quiet attention which is harder to ignore than laughter. "Give the warrior a sword," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried that particular firmness that belongs to people accustomed to their words having weight. The lion looked at her, then at Chenhu, then back at her. "The warrior chose his own weapon at registration," he said. "Let him fight with what he chose. Those are the rules." The tiger did not laugh. Chenhu noted this from the corner of his eye. The tiger was watching him with that sharp, focused attentiveness with which an experienced commander watches a battlefield, trying to understand something not yet formulated but already felt. His opponent turned out to be the last and largest fighter of the Claw clan. Broad across the shoulders, with a sword longer than most, with that particular weight in his movements that speaks not simply of physical strength, but of years of work with a heavy blade. Sifu's voice came from behind the barrier. Chenhu took the staff, looked at it for a moment, and threw it aside. The silence that fell over the arena was as abrupt as though something dense had been dropped over it from above. The gods stopped talking among themselves. The spectators stopped laughing. Chenhu took his stance, the hand-to-hand one, without weapons, hands lowered, knees slightly bent, and looked at the armed opponent calmly, the way you look at a problem that is difficult but solvable. The crowd did not understand. No one understood how a man without a weapon intended to hold his ground against a fully armed swordsman. Physically, mechanically, by what means? His opponent did not rush either, and this Chenhu noted at once, with something close to respect. A man with an obvious advantage did not charge forward mindlessly, but stood and waited, building his tactics. Which meant he was thinking. Which meant he was dangerous not only with the sword. The crowd began to whistle, demanding movement, demanding the spectacle this strange, weaponless entrance had promised. Chenhu paid no attention. Neither did his opponent. Then his opponent moved. The strike was fast, horizontal, at chest height with good arc. No one saw what happened next. Simply in one moment the sword was in motion, and in the next, both of Chenhu's palms were gripping the blade. Not the hilt, the blade, with bare hands from both sides, locked. For several seconds, nothing happened. His opponent pressed. Chenhu held. Then Chenhu began to move forward, slowly, step by step, pushing his opponent back with his own sword, and the man retreated because there was no choice. Either retreat or release the weapon, and releasing the weapon meant losing even faster. Against the arena wall, his opponent stopped, literally, shoulders touching stone. Chenhu kept pressing. The point turned slowly, not toward the throat, but toward the face, and when the cold metal touched the chin, a thin, dark thread began to run from beneath it. The fighter cried out, then yielded. Chenhu opened his palms, stepped back. From his hands came a slow, heavy drip, dark drops onto pale stone. The crowd exploded. Sifu vaulted over the barrier, not through the gate, over it, and embraced Chenhu with the genuine joy that came through in him without any irony when he was not thinking about how he looked. "I believed in you," he shouted. "Always believed. Well, almost always. Well, I bet against you, but that was a technical bet, not an emotional one. Those are completely different things." The lion god looked at Chenhu, then said, quietly, but so that the entire arena heard, "What would he be if he knew how to use a sword?" He turned to the tiger, and in that turn there was something mocking, light, almost inoffensive, but mocking. Your student nearly got a shave from a village hunter with bare hands. Is that your finest fighter from the clan?" The tiger did not flinch. He was looking at Chenhu with that same expression of sharp, focused attentiveness, as though the lion's question did not concern him, because in his own mind there was a different question, a more important one. The lion god announced all the contests concluded, and the gods withdrew into the temple. Not hurriedly, with that particular unhurriedness that belongs to beings for whom time is a tool rather than a limitation. They departed one after another, taking their true forms or remaining in human ones, each in their own way, without explanation. The phoenix was last to disappear through the temple gates, and the heat on the arena began to subside as quickly as if it had never existed. Only the stone underfoot still held its warmth, the way earth holds it after a long day when the sun has already gone, but the memory of it has not. The participants waited, some standing, some seated on the benches at the barrier, some simply lowering themselves to the ground right where they stood. The weariness after 4 contests and 3 divine interventions was real, substantial, the kind that settles not only into muscles but into the mind. Sifu stood beside Chenhu and looked at the arena soberly, without his usual bravado. Quote, 129, quote, he said. Chenhu looked at him. Quote, 130, quote, Sifu added. Quote, 131, quote. He was quiet for a moment. Quote, 132, quote, quote, 133, quote, said Chenhu. Sifu smiled, not his usual smile, but a slightly different one, a little quieter. Quote, 134, he shrugged. Quote, 135. Chenhu was about to say something, and did not, because in that moment he felt pain. Not at once, first simply warmth in his side, the wrong kind of warmth, not the kind that comes from fatigue or sun. Then, sharper. He looked down and saw a dark stain spreading through the fabric, slowly, with that unhurried inevitability with which water spreads through a poor roof when the sun has already gone, but the memory of the rain has not. A short knife, twisted, the signature of the Dark Thread clan, the strike delivered not from outside but in a crowd, when the body is pressed against other bodies, and the movement is almost imperceptible, almost accidental, almost like a neighbor's push. Someone cried out. Chenhu grabbed his side. Sifu turned, and his face changed instantly, all the irony and bravado falling away like leaves in a gust of wind, leaving something else behind, something real. "Hold on," he said sharply, catching Chenhu under the arm. "Hold on, I've got you." Somewhere in the crowd, black figures flickered. They were already leaving, dissolving among the people with that smooth invisibility 300 years of practice had given them. Someone in the crowd shouted, pointing. The guards gave chase. Chenhu watched them go and understood. They would not catch them. They never do. That, too, is part of the work. "Shame you threw the staff away," said Sifu, and his voice was taut, unlike its usual self. "It would have come in handy right about now." Chenhu's legs gave, not from pain, from blood loss, which was moving faster than he had reckoned. Sifu held him firmly, not letting him fall, and in that hold there was nothing for show, simply one man holding another because otherwise the other will fall. The guards returned quickly, breathless, with the guilty faces of people who know they have failed, but have not yet decided whether to admit it immediately or delay. Quote, 140, said the senior guard. Quote, 141. Chenhu opened his mouth, and at that moment, the gods came out of the temple. They appeared all at once, without announcement, and the crowd that had just been buzzing with excitement and alarm fell still again, reflexively, the way a candle flame stills in a draft, not going out, simply ceasing to move for a moment. The lion took his place, looked at the people for a long time, with that gaze which sees rather than studies. Underscore underscore quote underscore 142 underscore underscore, he said. The crowd held its breath. It was audible, literally audible, the sound of several hundred people simultaneously stopping breathing and waiting. Underscore underscore quote underscore 143 underscore underscore. The silence changed in quality, from expectant to bewildered. People began to exchange glances. No one remembered this, not because it was impossible by the rules, simply because in the entire history of the tournaments it had never happened. 2 winners, simultaneously. Quote, 144, said the lion. Quote, 145. A murmur passed through the crowd like a wave, first in the nearest rows, then further, to the very edges of the square, where those who had come simply to watch now no longer understood quite what they were watching. Underscore underscore quote underscore 146 underscore underscore, someone said loudly. Underscore underscore quote underscore 147 underscore underscore, someone else answered, louder still. The lion raised his head and gave a short roar, not at full strength, simply enough for the murmur to break off and for people to remember that before them stood not a man announcing the results of a competition, but the first of the pantheon of gods, and between those two things there is a difference. Quote, 148, he said when it was quiet. Quote, 149. He held a pause, a short one, exactly as long as was needed for the next word. Underscore underscore. Quote underscore. 150 underscore underscore. The silence that followed these words was of a different kind from all the previous ones. Not bewildered, not awed, simply absolute. The way silence is absolute only in 2 situations, when there is no one nearby, or when everyone around cannot believe what they have just heard. Then the silence ended, and the crowd erupted again, but differently this time, mixed, in several voices at once, some shouting approval, some shouting in outrage, some simply shouting, not yet certain of their own feelings. Quote, 151, said Sifu. He said it quietly, but with the intonation of a man who has made a decision and now intends to state it regardless of the consequences. He stepped forward, holding Chenhu with one hand and addressing the god's dais with the other. The bout must be postponed, he said loudly so the gods could hear. Chenhu is wounded. He was just stabbed with a knife. He is bleeding right now. What bout to the death when one of the participants is already dying? The gods looked at the wound. The goddess of the crescent made a barely perceptible movement, not a gesture, simply a change in how she was sitting, slightly forward, slightly more tense. The people in the crowd were also looking, and in their expressions was the confusion that comes when the rules they have been accustomed to trusting suddenly cease to seem just. The lion looked at the wound, then at Chenhu, then said, "The rules of the tournament are inviolable. The tournament begins at sunrise and ends at sunset. The bout must take place today. This is an ancient custom, and it does not change for circumstances." The crowd gasped. Not all of them, but enough that the sound was audible. Chenhu stood, holding his side, feeling the blood slowly saturating the fabric beneath his palm, and looked at the lion. His mind was strangely quiet. Not the quiet that comes from weakness, but the kind that comes when everything is already understood and there is nothing left to think about. The bout would happen, while wounded, against Mo, who had fought all day and had not received a single scratch, against a man who had a sword and knew how to use it. This was not a problem. It was a wall. He released his side, straightened, looked at Sifu. "Bind it," he said. Sifu bandaged him in silence. That in itself was unusual. Sifu rarely did anything in silence, and his silence now said more than all his words usually said together. He tore a length of fabric, long, white, from inside his coat, where he always kept something prepared for occasions he called unforeseen aloud, but in truth simply foresaw in advance. He wrapped Chenhu's torso firmly, with that careful tightness that belongs to people who know how to bandage not because they were taught, but because they have had to. Quote, 156, he said, tying the last knot. Quote, 157. Quote, 158. Sifu did not raise his voice. Quote, 159. Quote, 160. Chenhu checked the bandage with his palm. Tight, holding. Sifu looked at him for several seconds, then lowered his hands. Sifu was quiet, which was perhaps the third or fourth time in all their acquaintance that he had done so without argument. From outside came a roar, not human, low, rising from the chest like thunder from a cloud. The lion was announcing the final. His voice rolled across the square and, it seemed, across the entire city, reflecting off walls and tiled rooftops, disturbing sparrows on the eaves and making merchants in the far stalls pause their conversations for a moment and look up. The finalists were to come to the center of the arena, now. Chenhu straightened, touched the bandage one last time. Not because he doubted it, simply the hunter's habit of checking his gear before going out. Then, walked toward the exit from under the awning. Sifu walked beside him all the way to the edge, to that line beyond which he could not go. They stopped. Chenhu took one more step, and another, and walked out into the center. The arena met him with a roar. The crowd was in a frenzy, that particular frenzy that belongs to people who have waited a long time for something enormous and have finally received it. They shouted names. They shouted for no reason. They whistled and clapped. And in that collective sound there was nothing of last night's festive warmth by the fires. That had been warmth. This was thirst. Different things. Mo was already standing in the center, with his sword. Calm. The same way he had stood all day, the way he had stood in the registration line, the way he always stood, as far as Chenhu had been able to observe. The scar on his cheekbone looked deeper in the evening light than it ever had. He looked at Chenhu, at the bandage, at the empty hands, and something in his face changed. Not pity, not contempt, something that had no simple name. Mo raised his sword. The bout was called. The first strike came quickly, not with lightning speed, but quickly, with that calibrated velocity which is the result not of explosive force, but of years of precision. Horizontal, at chest height. Chenhu moved, barely. A fraction slower than that morning, a fraction heavier, as though between his body and the commands his mind was sending it there had appeared a layer of something viscous, slowing the transmission. Sifu shouted from the edge. __, quote _168 __. And then, considerably quieter, under his breath. __, quote _169 __. Second strike. Third. Chenhu moved aside, each time a little later than he would have wished, a little closer to the blade than was safe. Mo did not hurry. That too was part of his mastery. He did not try to finish quickly. He worked methodically, the way people work who know that time is on their side. A wounded man weakens. There is no need to rush. Simply continue. Chenhu stumbled. Not on flat ground. His foot found a crack in the stone, the one he had not noticed because he was watching the sword and not the ground. His knee came down on the stone, and his side immediately stabbed, sharply, as though someone had driven a hot rod into it. One hand went reflexively toward the wound. That was a mistake, and he knew it in the same instant. Mo raised his sword. Not sharply. He raised it, high, with that unhurried finality with which an executioner raises a blade. This is not an impulse. It is a decision. The blade came down. Chenhu's free hand rose and caught the edge. Not the hilt. The blade. With his bare palm, gripping from both sides, locked, the way he had done that morning in the sword sector, only now on his knees, now with a wound in his side, and blood from the clenched fist came immediately, faster and more freely than that morning, because his hands had already been used up by the day. The crowd went still. Mo pulled the sword toward himself, not with force, first simply testing. It did not move. He pulled harder. Chenhu held, with that inhuman, quiet stubbornness which has nothing to do with display, but is simply the property of a man who has no other option. Mo wrenched with all his strength, and Chenhu, at the last fraction of a second, opened his fingers. Mo, carried by his own pull, went backward. One step, another, losing his balance the way any effort loses it when it suddenly meets no resistance. And the blade flew from his grip, traced an arc, and struck the stone of the arena with a sound audible even through the roar of the crowd. Chenhu rose from his knee. It took longer than it should have, but he rose. Mo was rising too, faster, without a wound, without blood loss, with that enviable capacity for recovery that belongs to people who have not spent their entire reserve of strength by midday. Chenhu understood this, understood that if he gave him a second, Mo would be up, and without a sword he would still be dangerous, because such people are always dangerous regardless of what they hold in their hands. He struck, not once, many times, quickly, without pause, deliberately, at the face, because the face is what cannot be protected without hands, and Mo's hands were occupied with trying to rise. First strike, second, third. Each one cost Chenhu effort that was diminishing with every blow, but each one worked, and Mo remained on the ground, and his blood mixed on the stone with Chenhu's blood, and the crowd around them had grown as quiet as it had not been all day. Then, Chenhu satisfied himself that Mo would not rise, not because he was dead, but because his body had finally acknowledged what it had not wanted to acknowledge, and stopped. Stood upright, looked around. The crowd was watching him, thousands of faces, and all of them wanted the same thing. It was visible without words, without explanation, in the way they looked, the way they leaned forward, the way individual voices began to call out first, then more, then already in one rhythm, one word, again and again. Kill, kill, kill. Chenhu looked at Mo, at the man lying on the stone of the arena, looking up at the evening sky with the expression of one who has already accepted. Not death, simply whatever comes next, whatever it turns out to be, without fear, without pleading, simply accepted. Then Chenhu looked at the crowd. Then, at the lion. The lion sat on the dais, motionless, golden in the evening light, his mane of fire not stirring even in the wind. He looked at Chenhu with the expectation of one who has established the rules and now waits for them to be followed. Chenhu picked up Mo's sword from the ground, weighed it in his hand, looked at the blade. The crowd erupted, louder still, more insistent, and in that sound there was nothing human, nothing of the people who had sat by the fires last night and listened to the old man speak of how demons are born. Chenhu threw the sword aside, the ring of metal on stone. Silence. He extended his hand to Mo. Mo looked at it for a moment, then took it. Rose, slowly, heavily, with the dignity of a man who is lost honestly and accepts another's hand not as charity, but as what it is, simply a hand. When he had straightened, he looked at Chenhu briefly and nodded, without words. Some things require none. Chenhu turned to the crowd. "Be quiet," he said. It was not a shout. It was said in an ordinary voice, but such that everyone heard. The crowd fell silent. "Look at yourselves," said Chenhu. His voice was even, not from calm, but from that exhaustion which, past a certain point, becomes something else, something resembling clarity. You are thirsting for blood. You are shouting kill at a man who has done nothing to you, who fought honestly and deserves to be alive. Look at yourselves. What do you look like? This is not how people behave. This is how demons behave. And you are people. And I will not kill when it can be avoided. This man has done nothing to me. The lion rose, not sharply, slowly, with that deliberate unhurriedness that belongs to beings who know that a single movement from them already changes the air around them. He descended from the dais, one step, another, and stopped several paces from Chenhu. He looked down at him with an expression that on a human face might have been called curiosity, but on the lion's face was something greater and not as safe. Quote, he said. His voice was quiet, and for that reason twice as frightening as if it had thundered. Quote, he bared his teeth, not aggressively, almost pensively, the way one bares their teeth when they have not yet decided whether to be angry or to laugh, and the interval between those two things contains something more dangerous than either. The crowd went still, the very crowd that had been in a frenzy a moment ago, demanding blood, now standing in absolute silence, because a god stood on the arena and was speaking to a man, and no sane person in such a moment wishes to draw attention to themselves. The goddess of the crescent rose from her place. Quote, 176 she said. Her voice was even, without the intonation of argument, simply a statement, delivered the way one delivers things that are themselves an argument. Quote, 177 The lion looked at her, then at Chenhu. Then the bared teeth slowly disappeared, not because the argument had convinced him, but because something within him had shifted. Some internal scale had tipped in a different direction. Quote, 178, quote, he said. Quote, 179, quote. The crowd erupted again, but differently this time, more cleanly, without the thirst that had been in the cries of quote, 180 simply joy. The relief that comes when long tension finally finds its release. Chenhu heard it as though through water. The sound was there, but reached him late, as though a barrier had formed between him and the world, thin, transparent, but dense. He felt his legs go. Not at once. First he simply swayed, then his knees bent on their own, without his involvement, and he began to sink. Sifu caught him before he fell, grabbed him under the arm, held him, set him upright again, though quote 181 quote was a relative concept, because standing properly was something Chenhu could no longer do, only with support. Quote 182 quote, said Chenhu. Quote 183 quote, said Sifu. The lion descended onto the arena, fully, walked out to the center, to where Chenhu stood, and stopped before him. Up close, he was enormous. Not the way he was enormous in his true form, but even in his human one, his presence occupied more space than any person Chenhu had ever seen. The mane of fire gave off warmth, real, palpable, and Chenhu, bleeding in the cooling evening air, felt it on his face. Quote 185, said the lion. Quote 186, quote. He paused. Quote 187, quote. The crowd applauded. The lion raised his hand and the applause subsided. Quote 188, quote, he said. Quote 189, quote. Sifu leaned close to Chenhu's ear, close, almost touching. Say nothing, he whispered. Chenhu, I'm asking you, just nod and be quiet, once in your life. Chenhu was silent for a second, perhaps two. A demon shapeshifter killed my parents, he said. The silence came instantly, the kind that had not existed at any point in the day, not when the lion had roared, not when Chenhu had caught the blade with his bare hands. This silence was of a different kind. The silence of people who have heard something that has, for a moment, changed the shape of the world around them. My entire life, Chenhu continued, and his voice was even, not because he was calm, but because behind these words lay so many years that they no longer required intonation. They carried sufficient weight on their own. My entire life was one movement, toward this, toward revenge. I did not come here to protect humanity. I came here to become strong enough to kill him. The lion looked at him. For a long time. Killing a demon is forbidden, he said at last. Such is the code. Such is the law, which has existed longer than people have existed. The chosen ones are made into gods, not for killing, for capturing and confining. Demons go to hell, where they belong. Killing a demon is unthinkable. Then you should know this, said Chenhu. My purpose is not service. My purpose is the death of the one who killed my family. Only that. Nothing more. I cannot make a god of a man consumed by revenge, said the lion. His voice grew quieter, and for that reason heavier. Revenge is blindness. A god cannot be blind. This is my path, said Chenhu, and no one will change it, not even gods. The substance of my nature is not something that changes with words or prohibitions. Only one thing can change me: the death of the one who killed my parents. Renounce revenge, said the lion. Renounce it, and I will make you a god. Chenhu looked at him. What kind of god is this, he said slowly, who forbids killing a demon but commands killing a man? The lion bared his teeth. Not pensively this time, but in earnest, and in that bearing was everything the first of the pantheon knew how to restrain but did not always wish to. You are stripped of the title of Chosen One, he said, permanently. No tournament, no contest, no victory will open the path to the pantheon for you. This is my word, and it does not change. Chenhu understood. Not immediately. First the words arrived, then the meaning, then what stands behind the meaning. The only way to become strong enough to kill the demon, the only path that existed. Closed, permanently, by one word from a being whose words do not change. He struck, not because he expected to connect, simply because something inside him had compressed to its limit and found the only release it knew. His fist went forward, and the lion caught it with one light movement, almost casual, the way you catch a fly, and threw Chenhu backward. Not with force, simply redirected him, the way you redirect water with a palm, and Chenhu flew across the entire arena and struck the stone at the far barrier. Sifu ran to him. The crowd was in a frenzy, now in complete bewilderment, because there was no winner, no chosen one, none of the thing for which all of this had been arranged. And in that bewilderment, something dark was beginning to form, the very thing the old man had spoken of by the fire. The lion looked at Chenhu by the far wall, then at the crowd, then said, with a weariness that belongs to those who have grown tired of being angry, Mo. Mo stood where he had stood, at the edge of the arena, watching everything that had happened with the same face he always had. You are second in points. The Pantheon offers you the place of the Chosen One. Accept, and this tournament will have had meaning. Mo was silent for a long time, then said, I believe in you, Lion. All my life. That is the truth. A pause. But I am a warrior of honor, and the one who proved stronger than me, wounded, without weapons, against a sword, is standing at that wall. I cannot take the trophy of a winner who is not won through any fault of mine. Honor does not permit it. This is my command, said the lion. Then I am sorry, said Mo, but no. The lion looked at him for a long time. So be it, he said at last, and in those 3 words was the weariness that belongs to beings accustomed to having their will carried out, who have suddenly encountered a day on which that rule was broken twice in succession. This tournament remains without a winner. The crowd exploded. not with joy or admiration, with that particular fury born of betrayed expectation. People had come for a miracle, for a transformation, for confirmation that any one of them might one day become a god, and had not received it. And now that betrayed expectation was searching for a way out. The gods rose in silence, one after another, without words, taking their true forms the way one closes a door, simply dividing one space from another. The phoenix vanished in a flash. The tortoise sank into the air as into water. The deer stepped and was gone. The dragon coiled and dissolved. The lion was last to leave the arena, and his departure was the quietest, simply golden light, and then it was not there. The goddess of the crescent was last to linger. She did not take her true form, simply stood and looked at Chenhu, whom Sifu was already holding upright at the far wall. In her gaze was something that had no name in the human tongue, not pity, not anxiety, something more ancient and more quiet. She looked the way the moon looks at everything that happens below. It sees, but does not intervene, because that is its nature, to illuminate, but not to change. Then she too was gone. The square was in uproar. Chenhu heard it from a distance, the distance that blood loss creates when the world around begins to seem no less real, but considerably less important. Sifu was saying something to him. He heard the voice, but not the words. He felt a hand on his shoulder, felt the cold of the stone at his back. Then, darkness. He came to his senses from a smell, not from pain. The pain was there, but it had already become a familiar background, that constant hum to which the body adapts and ceases to treat as an event. The smell was different, sharp, herbal, with a bitterness that belongs to remedies made by people who know their craft and are unconcerned with whether the patient finds it pleasant. Chenhu opened his eyes. A tent, low, of coarse fabric that let through light. Not the daytime kind, but softer, diffused, the way light is at the end of a day or the beginning of a morning. Beyond the tent walls came the sounds of movement, voices, footsteps, the distant sound of something wooden striking stone. The city was carrying on, indifferent to what had happened on the arena, or interested in its own way. Through conversations, rumors, retellings that with each new mouth became less and less like what had actually occurred. Chenhu tried to sit up. It worked, slowly, with an effort that reminded him the body remembers everything he had done to it and intends to keep reminding him for some time. "Oh," said Sifu. Chenhu turned his head. Sifu was standing in the corner of the tent talking to a serving girl, a young woman with a basket of remedies, who was listening to him with the expression that appears on people who want a conversation to end, but don't know how to indicate this politely. Sifu was saying something, judging by the gestures, something self-satisfied and, in his estimation, clever. The girl stepped back, then another step, then pushed his hand from her shoulder and left the tent with a haste that was no longer politeness, but simply speed. Sifu called after her. The tent flap fell. Sifu stood for a moment, then turned to Chenhu with the air of a man accustomed to the world not always appreciating him at his worth, and long since at peace with that. Quote, 221, he said. Not as a question, as a statement, with that relief in his voice which he evidently intended to conceal, but wasn't trying very hard to. Welcome back. Chenhu tried to stand. His legs held, weakly, but held. Stop, stop, said Sifu, moving forward. The healer said to lie down. After something like that, you lie down. I would lie down, happily, 3 days minimum, without a shred of guilt. How long was I out? Asked Chenhu. 5 moons, said Sifu. The 6th sun has started. Chenhu processed this information. Something in his face changed, not sharply, but Sifu, who had already learned to read that face better than he would have wished, noticed. 5 days, said Chenhu. Yes, Sifu paused. So what? Where are you hurrying? Time is moving, said Chenhu. The demon will appear. And I didn't become a god. I need another way. Sifu opened his mouth, closed it, then said, Listen, since neither I nor Mo ended up with anything to show for it, maybe we send the Pantheon an application. Something like, candidates available, please consider? I could write it. I have good handwriting. Chenhu looked at him. A joke, said Sifu immediately. An obvious joke. They left the city in silence. Chenhu ahead, Sifu slightly behind, at the distance that allowed him to catch if needed, but was not intrusive. The road went through a field into a forest, and the forest received them with that dense, damp silence that belongs to old trees accustomed to human affairs happening beneath them, and long since ceased to be surprised by them. Chenhu stopped when the trees had closed around them. He stood for a moment, then turned to the nearest oak, old, with a trunk 3 arm spans around, its bark hardened over centuries into something halfway between wood and stone, and struck. His fist went into the trunk. The tree swayed. A crack ran through the bark, from the point of impact in all directions, the way ice cracks when a stone is thrown into it. Several birds burst from the branches with frightened cries. Sifu stood and looked at the crack, then at Chenhu, then at the crack again. All right, he said quietly. Maybe you have lain down long enough. Chenhu lowered himself to the ground at the roots of the oak, leaned his back against the trunk. The anger had gone into the blow, but not all of it. Some remained inside, quiet and hot, like coals beneath ash that do not go out, simply cease to be visible. Go your own way, he said. Sifu did not answer at once. He stood looking into the forest, turning a twig between his fingers that he had picked up from the ground. A mindless, distracted movement that belongs to people thinking something through and in no hurry to reach conclusions. Did you hear me? Said Chenhu. There is nothing that binds us anymore. The tournament is over. My path is not one on which you make companions. Go where you were going. And where are you going? Asked Sifu. That is not your concern. Without a clan, without gods, without a way to kill the demon, and not my concern, repeated Sifu thoughtfully, as though testing how reasonable that sounded. Understood. Very convincing. Sifu. A warning entered Chenhu's voice. __quote _246 ___. Something in Sifu's face changed. Not offense. Something deeper. The kind one usually doesn't show. Quote 247 quote, he said. His voice was different. Without irony, without bravado. Simply a voice. Quote 248 quote. Chenhu was silent. Quote 249, said Sifu. Quote 250. He dropped the twig. Quote 251. The silence in the forest was dense and alive. The rustle of leaves, the distant knock of a woodpecker, the wind in the canopy. Quote 252, said Chenhu. Quote 253. Quote 254, repeated Sifu. And in his voice there was no anger, only the weariness that belongs to people who have tried for a long time to get through to someone and have understood that it won't work. You don't carry it. It drags you. And you call that a path? He stood, brushed off his clothes, took several steps in one direction, toward where the road forked. Stopped, not turning. Good luck, he said, with your demon. He took another step, then another, and then the old man came out of the undergrowth. Sifu stopped, sharply, the way you stop when you unexpectedly see something familiar in an unfamiliar place. He turned to Chenhu. That's him, he said quietly, by the fire. The one who was telling the stories about demons. The old man was the same face, deeply carved by time, the same eyes, alive and too bright for an old man. He walked through the forest with the same ease with which one walks along an open road. No branch caught him, no root stopped him, as though the forest stepped aside of its own accord, making no event of it. He stopped before Chenhu and said without preamble, "How great is your desire to kill the demon shapeshifter?" "Leave me alone," said Chenhu. "Don't test the patience for respect for elders." "If your intentions are as great as you have said," said the old man, as though he hadn't heard. Chenhu looked at him. He gave a short, mirthless smile. The old man smiled, slowly, the way people smile who have been waiting for precisely this question. Something in that smile was wrong. Chenhu felt it before he understood it. That sensation that comes when you look at a thing and see a thing, but something inside already knows it is not a thing. A back too straight, a step too light, too much in the eyes, too much of everything, for them to belong to simply an old man on a forest road, said Chenhu. The old man no longer smiled. He stood for a moment, motionless, the way something stands before becoming itself, and began to change, swiftly. Without the ceremony of the arena, simply the figure expanded, grew, and where the old man had stood, there now stood the tiger. Enormous, with bull's horns and 4 eyes, with a tail ending sharply as a spear, with claws each one the length of a knife. He filled the space between the trees, not physically, but with a presence that pressed on the chest the way the air presses before a storm. Sifu, who had not yet managed to leave, stood 3 paces away and looked at all of this with the expression of a man who has run out of words, which in itself was a rare and significant event. The tiger looked at Chenhu. Then, through the roar which was his voice in his true form, low, coming not from the throat but from the chest, from that place where in animals the strength lives, said, "I will help you kill the demon shapeshifter." Silence. Then Sifu slowly exhaled. "So," he said, "I did the right thing after all, not leaving. Thank you for watching. Now you understand that Chenhu's story is leading toward a far darker and longer path than the one he would have walked as a god. From this point on, he must find a way to achieve his revenge as an ordinary human. And now he knows that his deepest desire is forbidden, a taboo established by the lion himself. What will Chenhu do next? Will he surrender? Or challenge the lion god himself? We'll find out in the next episode. And for now, write your theories in the comments. Why do you think the gods forbid killing demons in this world?